Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar series, Lunch with the Birds. My name is Amanda Duran, and I'm the Program Coordinator for the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative. Before we get started today, welcome for anyone who's new in joining us, and I wanted to let you all know that today's webinar will be recorded and archived on our website at obcinet.org, as well as on our YouTube channel. So here's a list of some of our recently added videos, and last month's webinar, which was on balancing agricultural pressures and birds, is also uploaded on our site. So if you weren't able to join us last month, I encourage you to check that out and watch that recording. And the recording from today's video should be up by the end of this week, but everyone will receive an email with a link to view that after the webinar. We're very excited about our presentation coming up next month on keeping cats indoors, and that will be presented by Grant Sizemore of the American Bird Conservancy. So if you have any questions about not only why it's better to keep your cats indoors, but how to maybe talk to friends and neighbors about why it's important to keep your cats indoors for both the cats and for birds, I encourage you to join us for that webinar on October 21st. And then coming up in November, a timely presentation for the season on wild turkeys, a little bit about the ecology of those birds and how their populations have changed here in Ohio over the years. I'd like to thank our sponsor of today's webinar, Global Conservation Connections, and I encourage you to go to their website at gcconnections.org to learn more about that organization. Before we get started today, just a few things. If you have any questions, feel free to enter those in the chat box, although I will be holding those until the end, so our presenter will address all the questions at the end of the presentation. But if you're having any technical issues or have any sort of other questions, feel free to enter those, and I will be responding to those throughout the webinar. So I'm very excited to have with us today Randall Rogers. Randy is a Columbus birdwatcher and board member at Green Lawn Cemetery, where he chairs the Grounds and Historical Preservation Committee. And Randy will be talking to us today about Green Lawn Cemetery. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Randy.
Well, good morning. This morning we're going to talk about one of my favorite places in Columbus, Green Lawn Cemetery. I've been asked to do something that is a Herculean task, and that is to address both the history and the wildlife of the park, either one of which we could go on and on for hours about. But hopefully we'll condense this down and get some highlights and give you a good introduction and overview of the park and what we have to offer. A few quick facts is the cemetery was established in 1848 as a rural cemetery, and that's an important term that we'll talk more about in a few minutes. We have about 360 acres. About 70% of that is currently developed. 155,000 plus internments. It's an active cemetery, and we believe we have capacity to keep going for another 100 years. We are an arboretum by the Cemetery Association. We're working on becoming an arboretum by the forest folks, which I think would be nice. And we are an Audubon Important Bird Area, which again is something we'll talk a little bit more about as we go along. So taking the James Michener approach to history, we'll go way back to the beginning and talk about our bedrock at Green Lawn Cemetery, which is from the Devonian period. At that time, Ohio was covered by a shallow, warm sea, and so we have a lot of fossils in our bedrock of things like tribolites and a neat bedrock, but piled up on top of that bedrock is all of this gravel from the glaciers. And in our area, we're covered with a lot of ground moraine from the Wisconsin age glaciers, 14 to 24,000 years ago. And that's what gives us in central Ohio its natural rolling, gentle hills. Turning up the geologic clock by several hundreds of thousands of millions of years, we'll skip to 1786 and talk a little bit about what the original forest cover of the cemetery at the time of settlement was. And at the time of settlement, we were a mixed oak forest. And it's cool because that's one of the great things about Green Lawn is that we are still largely a mixed oak forest. But we were a mixed oak forest with perhaps some elm ash community as it got a little closer towards the river, and maybe a little mixed mesic or a little oak maple around the edges a bit, and maybe even a few patches of prairie grassland left over. But at the time of settlement, we mostly were mixed oak. And turning the clock ahead another 100 years or so, of course, around 18, the early 1800s, a man named Lucas Sullivan founded Franklinton, which became Columbus. And the Sullivan family was very important in early Columbus history. You had, of course, Lucas as the founder of the city, and then his sons, Joseph and William Starling, and his daughter-in-law, all very important naturalists and involved in history. But the one that we want to focus on is probably his younger son, Joseph Sullivan. Joseph Sullivan was selected as the first president of the Board of Trustees and was the guy largely responsible for getting the cemetery founded. And if you picture, Columbus back then, it was a much smaller community, obviously, and this guy was really one of the mover and shakers. He helped found the university that would become Ohio State University. He was a naturalist and a collector, and on the Board of Education. And when he came onto the board at Greenlawn, what they wanted to do was move the cemetery away from the downtown area and move it out into a more rural area. And he was the guy responsible for finding the land and getting that done. And the person he went and talked to about that was a lady named Mary Minor Wharton. And the reason that they wanted to get it away from the city, and the reason he went and talked to Mary Minor Wharton, is her family owned some wooded area, about 1,000 acres south of the city, and it had been cattle ranched. And the idea of the rural cemeteries is, if you picture establishing a brand new city, you lay out your main street and you're going to set up some business districts and a residential district, maybe set aside some land for your public buildings, also for your school, and also for your church and your graveyard. Well, as your city grows, suddenly you have your church and your graveyard right downtown, and it's using, for one thing, valuable real estate, but also in days where medicine wasn't quite as advanced, you would have plague and smallpox and cholera and these big epidemic diseases go through, and you would be bringing all of these recently deceased right into the middle of your population center. So by the 1840s, this rural cemetery movement started to push cemeteries away from the population center and locate them in a more natural setting where you could go out and have bridle trails and maybe ponds or fountains, have a picnic, and find some serenity in nature. And Mary Minor Wharton's family owned that sort of property when Joseph Sullivan started looking for where are we going to put this new cemetery. And the reason that the Minor family had that is that her father and her uncle, Jeremiah and Isaac, had come into, they were some of the first English settlers in central Ohio, and they had established a cattle ranch. And the practice of the day was, for cattle ranching, is you would just let the cattle graze in the woods and periodically round them up and drive them to market. And because of that, if you were a farmer, you'd be cutting down the trees, you'd be changing the topography by, tilling up the land. Obviously, if you were building the city on the land, you would be doing that same stuff. But as a rancher, you left the landscape trees in place, and you didn't really change the topography of the land. So they had this beautiful rural property, and it had actually preserved through the settlement period some of central Ohio's natural topography and natural mixed oak forest. And Mary Wharton Minor was very agreeable, and she provided some of the land in the first 80-some acres that established the cemetery. And she also provided a right-of-way for access. And she had lived on the property for most of her life. She was born there, and then her family moved when she was a young child over to London. But in her teenage years, she actually moved back to the homestead in Columbus and lived there well into her 90s when she died, and was known as the Belle of Columbus, and that property was a famous place. Her house was a famous place for dignitaries visiting Columbus to stop in. This is a picture of the minor residence in its original form. It's been modified a little bit, but and in fact, it's been actually turn 90 degrees on its foundation, but it does actually still stand just about a mile or so from the front gate of the cemetery. And there's a guy living there now who fully knows the history of the house and appreciates it. Unfortunately, it's not something that anyone has ever done anything with to make it open to the public. But the fact that they had this land that had been ranched and was fairly virgin forest and topography made it the perfect location. So their next step was to select a landscape architect, and the guy they went with was a guy named Howard Daniels. And as this slide suggests, I have yet to find a picture of Howard Daniels. I'm sure there's one out there somewhere because he was a fairly prominent guy, but I've never come across it. But Howard Daniels was one of the preeminent in the entire country landscape architects. He competed for the design at Central Park and was third runner-up. And so that's the level of work that he was doing. And one of his specialties, there's a number of famous buildings around Ohio that he did, a couple of which still stand. The old Montgomery County Courthouse is still up. Rookwood Mansion, Rookwood Pottery, that family down in Cincinnati, that mansion is gone, but it was a beautiful mansion. He did that. But his specialty was really these landscape, these rural cemeteries, and he did a whole series of them, of which Green Lawn was his second project. And many of them, there's about 15 of them that still exist, and I've got those listed here. And his concept was that it was a very American place, and that it was a progressive place in terms of a public green space for gardens and parks and recreation, in addition to providing the cemetery service. And if you look at any of his projects, you'll find that they are very built into the terrain and with the original trees and winding paths. And to kind of get an idea of what this movement was trying to do, I found this great quote in Helen Hooven's book, Ohio Town, and I really think it sums up what the rural cemetery movement was trying to achieve. It says, "A labyrinth of drives winds in and out among the headstones and monuments. Here and there a weeping willow tree or a flowering shrub ornaments some family lot. On and between the graves the grass grows thick and green, and over all are the trees. Once upon a time chestnuts, and still maples, and that great trinity of oak, ash, and elm." And I just think that's a wonderful description of what the rural cemetery strove to be. And it also points out some of the challenges in maintaining the rural cemeteries, because as she notes, at one time chestnuts, and then when she wrote this, still ashes and elm. And of course ash is currently going through a horrible situation, and elm previously have had their troubles. So the landscape has changed, but fortunately we do still have the oaks and the maples. And if you look at our layout, you'll see there's winding paths that go around the terrain and that really lay out a very casual way to just do a stroll. You can imagine taking a stroll and being in a natural setting. And of course preserving a lot of the green space and the trees. This is an old picture of the east entrance of Green Lawn, which is today the main entrance. And so since it was a ranch, and since it was created as a rural cemetery, it did preserve a lot of these beautiful landscape trees. And we have trees that are 200, 300, even 350 years old in the cemetery. And we also have some trees that have been planted, but were planted 150 years ago and have become impressive in their own right. And we have 5 state champions in the park. Great representations of some of the old oaks and native species, all of which helps make us a really important place for birds and wildlife, in addition to being a great place for people to visit. And because of that legacy, there's legacy trees and there's oak trees. We took that as an opportunity to recognize that once upon a time, Green Lawn would have been a stopover point for the passenger pigeon, and we still have some of those 300-year-old oak trees that remember passenger pigeons. Perhaps some of our trees were even planted as a result of the pigeons' activity. They were almost certainly fertilized by them. And so one of the things that we did in the park was we put up a monument to that, and we planted a new oak tree to take the place as we do lose some of our older ones, so that we can maintain that history and that knowledge and that connection to the past, and hopefully maybe even some of the lessons learned from the loss of the pigeons. And again, largely thanks to the preservation of those trees, we are included as part of the Scioto River Green Lawn Important Bird Area, which is basically two sections. One includes the Grange Audubon Center, Whittier Peninsula, and then runs down the river through Berliner Park. And then the other half of which is the cemetery itself. And of course, important bird areas are designated for a couple of different reasons. One, perhaps you have a particular species that is endangered or rare, or a species of concern that nests there, or uses it as a stopover point for migrants. And in the case of green lawn, it's mostly the latter, although we do have some sensitive species like great crested flycatcher that nest there and get visited by others. But the main thing is that because it has become this mature wooded island in close to the river and in the middle of what has grown up to become, the whole county is essentially developed. It is a great place for migratory stopovers, and that's really a key to us providing that habitat for those migrants, is really key to us being part of an important bird area. Well, talking a little bit about the people history of the cemetery, we have over 155,000 internments, and we consider that to be 155,000 stories. And some of those stories are very famous. We have 5 Medal of Honor recipients, probably the most famous of which is Captain Eddie Rickenbacker. We have 5 governors, James Rhodes among them, famous writers and actors and things. James Thurber is well known. Samuel Prescott Bush, founder of the Bush dynasty, grandfather and great-grandfather of Presidents Bush, is buried there. So, these are some real well-known people, but I always like to dig a little deeper, and there's people that maybe aren't among the first row of recognizable names, but are fascinating stories that you can learn about in the cemetery. And just to give a quick gloss over of a couple of those, one of the other Medal of Honor recipients is a guy named Benjamin Grierson, who was a Buffalo soldier and earned the Medal of Honor fighting the Apache in Arizona. Great story. This was an old veteran soldier. He was a sergeant, and he went out on a small patrol of a dozen men with a brand new lieutenant. And they caught up to some Apaches, about 50 of them, that they were trying to get back onto the reservation. And the Apaches agreed that they could come into camp and talk with them as long as they stacked their weapons and didn't bring their weapons into camp. And the lieutenant thought that was a great idea. But the old sergeant, Benjamin Grierson, didn't think that sounded like such a great plan, and so he kind of held on to his rifle and was going to be the last person to give his up. And as he did that, he saw the Indians starting to surround them, and eventually he saw one take up a position and point a rifle at the now unarmed lieutenant. And so he initiated the fight and actually led the men in horrible little hand-to-hand conflict and got them all safely out of the circle and to safety, and earned the Medal of Honor for that. And he's buried at Green Lawn Cemetery. He lived in Columbus and worked in Columbus in his later years, and died here and is buried here. Another fascinating character, Cromwell Dixon. Very few people hear of this guy anymore, but he earned a pilot's license at age 14. He started off by hand building balloons and flying balloons here in Columbus, and eventually got with the Curtiss Airplane Company and started flying an old Curtiss Pusher plane. Became at age 18, became the first man to ever fly across the Continental Divide, and died in an air show 3 days later. But he's buried with his mother and his sister, who were prominent in the local theater scene here, and he's at Green Lawn. And Alice Sheely, world-renowned watercolorist and impressionist and post-impressionist painter, and she's with us also, and interesting person to study. And a couple guys more related to the natural world. The explorer Thomas Blackiston is buried at Green Lawn. Blackiston fought in the Crimean War for the British Army and as an artillery officer, and then came to Canada and explored Western Canada and the Canadian Rockies. Went to China, became the first English person to go up the Yangtze River, further than anyone ever had before. Finally settled in Japan and made some really important scientific discoveries in Japan regarding how the island came together and why there's a differentiation between the flora and the fauna on the northern islands versus the southern islands. And he discovered some new species, including the largest living fish owl, the Blackiston's fish owl. And so he's a great character. No connection, you'll notice in that story, no connection whatsoever to Columbus, Ohio. But he died, he came back from Japan, he was in Southern California and did some great things out there, died out there. And his second wife was estranged at the time, and she was home in Wales visiting her family when he died. And so they contacted her because they couldn't figure out what to do with his body. And she said, well, I've got family in Columbus, Ohio. We have a family plot in Columbus. Why don't you bury him in our family plot in Columbus? So he's buried with his estranged second wife's family in Columbus, Ohio, a town that he never visited. So, but it is an interesting story that to find in the cemetery. A guy that maybe some people on this webinar actually remembers and actually knew, Milt Troutman. I first heard of Milt Troutman because as anyone who studies wildlife in Ohio is bound to come across the fishes of Ohio as probably one of the textbooks you carried around for a semester. But he also wrote some important books on birds and did some studies out at Buckeye Lake. Discovered a new species of mad tom darter type of fish. Him and his wife both are buried at Green Lawn, and both contributed tremendously to the science of fish and bird life in Ohio. And another guy, not quite so natural related, I guess, but an interesting story with a lot of local impact. Frederick Schumacher, who was essentially a snake oil salesman, who made a tremendous fortune doing that. He was a good snake oil salesman, apparently, and used that fortune to help found the Columbus Museum of Art. And then later on in life, he lost that money and actually made a second fortune going to Canada, to Ontario, looking for gold. Didn't find gold, but made a fortune finding silver, which, that's okay too. And is really well known in a couple little towns up there because he saw that among the native people that lived there, they didn't have enough money. They couldn't celebrate Christmas. So he used part of his money up there to establish a fund to buy presents for all of the children in those two towns. And that fund still buys Christmas presents for children today. So he's probably better known in Canada than what he is even in Columbus. And finally, I have to mention Frederick Packard because later on in the cemetery's history, as we started putting up chapels and mausoleums, the guy who designed a lot of those buildings was Frank Packard. And he actually designed a lot of the buildings, a lot of the original tall buildings in downtown Columbus. Not all of them still exist, but there's still some that are up, and also some of the prominent homes, the governor's home for one, here in town. And the chapel at Green Lawn and the Hayden Mausoleum, which is probably the more famous of all the mausoleums out there, and also his own mausoleum, which is unique. It's the 1920s Neo-Egyptian style. And so he had a big impact on how the cemetery looks today. Well, looking into some of the challenges of the cemetery, and we do have some. Invasive species is certainly one of them. We are fighting the emerald ash borers. We had 179 ash trees, of which 8 of them are surviving because we're treating 8 of them. We're trying to keep a representative. We're treating a couple blue ashes, a black ash, and then a couple each of white and green. But the rest of them are either dead or very quickly dying, so that's unfortunate. And we have garlic mustard, and probably the most terrible one that we fight is the honeysuckle. And we're doing quite a bit right now to try to line up resources and replace honeysuckle with native species so that we become a better habitat than what we are right now. And we have deer, and the deer are beautiful and they're great, but also they're a challenge for us because they rub out a lot of the trees we try to plant, and they do tremendous browsing damage. So we're trying to find the balance on how we deal with our deer situation, but also still preserve some of our plant life. But then there are things that aren't so challenging. Some things that are just great to see out there. And in addition to being a great place for bird watching, we're full of other animals also. And this is a picture of a couple baby foxes that I snapped year before last year. But we had 2 dens of baby foxes this year, and foxes and possums and raccoons and shrews and all the little suburban skunks, all the little suburban animals, and we even get coyotes coming into the cemetery now. And we have encouraged these things, especially some of our birds. We do have some breeding bird stations. We have a bluebird trail, which Columbus Audubon and Warren Grody in particular monitors for us and takes care of and does a great job. And we've raised a lot of tree swallows and a lot of bluebirds. And I think this year we had at least one set of house wrens that fledged. And we're adding some more stuff. We just put up a kestrel box this year, which we're hoping to have some results for next year. And right now we're in the process. We had a used chimney swift tower donated, and we're working on getting it stood up this fall so that next spring hopefully we can provide some habitat for chimney swifts. And this in addition to designating den trees. When we have a tree that is safe to leave standing, even if we top the dead limbs off of it, if we can leave even the trunk standing, we try to do that. And we're going to start labeling those as den trees with a little interpretive sign explaining that, yes, this looks like a dead tree, but actually this tree is left here on purpose because it's providing food for woodpeckers, it's providing a home for cavity nesting birds and for raccoons and possums and spiders and all those great things that live in those trees. And if you get rid of those, you really are providing a lot less habitat than you are if you keep them. So whenever it's not going to endanger a monument or endanger safety, we're trying to leave those up. And case in point, we had a return this year of our great horned owls. They nested and they fledged a young, and I think quite a few people here locally got good looks at this guy. It's really a great tree for viewing because there's a road that's keeps you probably 150 yards back from it, and you can sit there with your binoculars and your scope and get beautiful looks at it. And I went in there a couple weeks ago and I saw a huge limb had fallen from an oak tree right there, and I was just paranoid that it was affected the tree that the owls nested in, but it was actually the tree right beside it. So fortunately that tree is still holding up. And we're working to actively manage that and try to improve our habitat even further. And we started last year. Up to this point, we had never had a tree management plan in the cemetery. And without that, I mean, it's hard to manage for habitat, and it's hard to manage to preserve those remnant landscape trees and to preserve that mixed oak forest into the future if you don't have an inventory and a plan on how you're going to do that. So we started last year, we inventoried all of the landscape trees, which turned out to be over 4,300 landscape trees in the cemetery, identified them, measured them, mapped them in GIS online, and that built a database and a mapping feature that we can really do some good management with now. And it set us up for some future projects. For instance, this fall we're working now on putting together a tree trail, and we've identified about 120 trees in 3 trails of different themes and different lengths. And what you're going to be able to do, we hope, is at a minimum those trees will be labeled. You'll be able to go in and get a map on where they are and walk around and see them. But we're actually hoping that we'll be able to use a place called Web Cemeteries. It's an app that you download for free on your phone, and it'll pull up a story map, and you'll be say, I want to do this tree trail, and it will actually guide you from tree to tree, and even bring up a picture of that individual tree that you're looking for and tell you what it is, and navigate you there. So that's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be a great educational tool for the cemetery, and we're working on that right now. We got some great help from the Little Garden Club of Columbus, gave us a grant to help us fund getting some of that work done and getting all the signs put up. And that's also going to help us qualify as an arboretum, hopefully from the forestry people and not just the cemetery people. So this is an ongoing thing, and every year we go back and we update our inventory, and we field check 20% of it. So every 5 years we know that everything in the cemetery has been inventoried and field checked and is accurate within 5 years, which in the lifetime of a tree I think is sufficient for our purposes. And we found some great information out when we did that. For one thing, we found that we had out of 124 potentially desirable native species, we found that we had about 68 of them, about half of our trees in terms of species, and also half of them in terms of raw numbers are native. And that we have about 54 species that are pretty well represented, and 14 more that are maybe not so well represented but are there. And then we also found some problems. We found our invasives. We found things that are overrepresented. And one thing you can see as you go through the cemetery and look at the trees is you can see where there were different fads. We have a lot of Norway maples of a certain age. We have, again, a lot of London plane trees of a certain age, a lot of Dawn redwoods of a certain age, because those were the fad trees at the time. And one of the things that this shows us and that it helps us get away from is following those fads. And instead of planting Norway maples, hey, let's plant some sugar maples and some black maples and some red maples and things that are more appropriate to the habitat we're trying to preserve. And we've even found that some of our native trees were overrepresented. We have well over 100 hickory trees. They're all bitternut hickories. So one of our initiatives for this coming year will be to diversify and add some of our other hickory species to the park. So that again is great. It gives us some great management tools, and the fact that it's mappable is also great, because I can pull up a map. This is an example. I pulled up a map that shows all of our tree of heavens and all of our calorie pairs, which this summer these dots have been gradually disappearing and fading away as I've been going around and chopping them and squirting them full of poison. And we're replacing those, especially the calorie pairs, we're replacing with wild black cherry and American plum. And perhaps one of the most significant things it allows us to do is it lets us do analysis. This is a density map of those old oak trees. So this tells me what parts of the park I have the best representation of that mixed oak forest. And I know that these are the parts that I need to intensively manage. I need to make sure that as the older oaks reach 300, 350 years old and they start to fail, that I'm planning some appropriate oaks to take their place in the future, so that we don't end up in 50 or 100 years having a green lawn cemetery of a radically different character because those old native landscape trees are gone and nothing appropriate was planted to backfill them. Well, let's talk a little bit about then, if you are a bird watcher and you're not as familiar with green lawn, a little bit about what you can do there. So there's a couple really prominent and well-known birding areas in green lawn. And when you look at this map, I'll start just with some colors. So we have the big green circle. The big green circle is an area called the ravine. And it's an artificial ravine where they cut through the gravel of the gravel ridge, and they created a natural trail through there. And then around 1903, they spanned that with a cast iron bridge, which is still there. And over time, this is grown up, and it's one of the few really bushy places in the cemetery, and so it's a great migrant trap. And my challenge now is we're working to redevelop that area and do it in a way that it provides some sellable space that we can raise money then to preserve and to actually improve, because there's been a lot of Norway maples put in there. There's some honeysuckle in there, and so I want to get rid of that, and I want to backfill it with the native species and maintain, of course, the brushiness, and make it an even better migrant trap. It's an area that we don't have a lot of sycamore, a lot of American sycamore in the cemetery. This is an area I have targeted to get some sycamore into, and some of those other species that particular species of warblers will be attracted to. So that's definitely a place that all bird watchers tend to hit pretty hard. It's also nice because you can go across that bridge and you're kind of in the middle of the canopy of the trees that are planted down lower. So sometimes you get some better looks there than what you otherwise would from the ground. The next big circle is a blue circle. That circle is what we call the pond. Some people call it the pit. It's actually the old gravel quarry where they got the original crushed stone for the original roads through the park. And it does stay flooded most of the year. It tends to dry out some a little bit here in some of the drier months, but it does create some shorebird habitat as it does so, and it does have water most of the year, so we do get ducks there in the wintertime. I've had like hooded mergansers stop by there for a few days before. And again, it's brushy around the edges, and we do Columbus Audubon maintains a bird feeding station there, which we're upgrading and doing some improvement on this fall, so it's going to get nicer and nicer. And there has been some work done. It has a lot of, if you look at it, the outer edge of it seems like a lot of the brushiness is honeysuckle. But if you look through that honeysuckle, you'll find there's actually an inner circle of buttonbush, which is starting to develop really nicely in there. And so now the challenge is to continue to eat away at the honeysuckle and replace it. And I've done some planting this year of elderberry and some black chokeberry, and we're working on getting some native brushiness in there more than it is now. So, but that's a great bird watching place. I mean, the feeders make it easy. Sometimes you'll get some pine siskins there at the feeders with the goldfinches, but also just the brushiness and the water make it a premier spot in the cemetery. Then we have the big yellow circle. The big yellow circle is about 4 acres of prairie, and this was kind of an opportunity prairie. It's area that eventually will be developed in one way or another. But in the meantime, Jim McCormick was on the board and actually suggested, hey, why don't we get some use out of this? But let's turn it into a prairie. And it's actually turned into a really nice short grass prairie. And we're continuing to work to add some seed mixtures and get more diversity to it. But it's actually grown in pretty nice. And so that's a good area. That's where the chimney swift tower is going to go up, and that's where the bluebird boxes are, a lot of them. And it's a great place to look for wildlife. That's also an area of the park where it's not unusual to see a small herd of deer in a picturesque setting, and so it's a nice place to look for some of that wildlife too. And then also significant from a birdwatcher's perspective is if you kind of look in between the green circle and the blue circle, there's a yellow line that goes from north to south, and that kind of follows the western edge of the central ridge of the cemetery. And that ridge line that runs from north to south and kind of just goes down in between the blue and the green circles there. That high ground is always productive, to walk along. It's got some of the oldest oak trees, some of the best representation of that mixed oak forest. And in the wintertime, that's the great trail to follow to look for the merlins that we're pretty famous for hosting. They tend to perch, and if you just walk along that ridge line and look up into the tops of some of those trees, they tend to perch in the tops along there, and that's a great place to find them. As you get towards the southern end of that, you'll run into some areas that have a lot of sweet gum, and those are all oftentimes good areas to look for crossbills and pine siskins and and our sometimes large flocks of wintering goldfinches hang out in those areas. So that's kind of a little birder's guide to the cemetery and some of the great places there. And we encourage you, come out anytime. Um, bring your binoculars and bring your cameras. We have some dog stations up now, so if you want to walk your dog, there are a couple places where you can get plastic baggies and deposit said baggies. Um, Bring a picnic out. We are working in the future. We're looking for some places where maybe we can actually put a picnic area into someplace in the cemetery, because we really want to encourage people to come out and use it as an educational asset for the city, and just as a place to enjoy. And that's certainly how I was introduced to the cemetery, through bird watching and just going out there to look at the fall colors, which will be coming up here very shortly. And we certainly invite everyone else to come out and enjoy that as well. And hopefully, you'll see an interesting headstone or a name that catches your attention, and find out some of the interesting history. 155,000 stories to enjoy. So that's kind of the overview, without going too far in depth on particular speciation or individual histories or the monuments. But it's a wonderful place. I would like to mention that the first Saturday of every month, usually at 11 o'clock in the Huntington Chapel, we have what we call the First Saturday program. And it's free to the public, and it's something different every month. I've done a presentation similar to this one. We've had the Ohio National Guard come in and talk about some of the military folks that are buried there. We've had people with art history come in and talk about the artists, just a wide range of topics, local folks talking about some of the histories of some of these fascinating local people. And the architecture and everything else. So if you have a chance, every first Saturday we have that program, and you can stop by the office if you're interested in signing up for our newsletter. If you're into photography, we do have an annual photography contest you can participate in. So there's actually quite a few things, and it's really going to be a growing number of ways to enjoy the cemetery. But certainly, I think probably far and away one of the largest contingencies are bird watchers, and it's a beautiful place to walk around and see some beautiful birds. So we welcome everyone to come out and take a look. And that said, I think we have some time if anyone has any questions.
Great. So if anybody has any questions, please go ahead and enter those in the chat box, and Randy and I will try to answer those as best as we can. I have a quick question while we're waiting. Can you share with us maybe some of the most interesting migrants that have been observed as we're coming into migration season? Maybe some of the interesting species that people might be able to see if they would come out this time of year.
Yeah, well, and I noticed in my yard just the other day that some fall waves of fall wood warblers are definitely coming through still, and so any of the warblers are possible there, and we're within just a couple miles of where a Kirtland's warbler showed up a couple seasons ago, and there's certainly no reason you wouldn't maybe find that, or a mourning, or Nashville, or any of the wood warblers passing through. Between the river habitat part of the IBA and then our more drier upland woods, it's really a good spot to look for a variety of those. I actually, one thing that no one has ever done is compile any kind of a bird list of birds sighted at the cemetery, which I think would be interesting. We're working right now, and by the time you visit the newly revitalized bird watching area, the bird feeding area, we're going to have some bird checklists up for not just the cemetery, but for the entire IBA. And so that'll be helpful, and maybe we can get some folks to use those and sort of help us compile a record of some sort, because I think it'd be a lot of species.
Yeah, I think people will be surprised what you can find there.
I know at the metro parks here in Central Ohio,
it's not unusual during migration to maybe find 100 species in a day. And we don't have quite the variety of habitat that some of the metro parks do, but I would think that Greenlawn, you could have some pretty nice days.
Does the cemetery get many hummingbirds?
We do. We do have a pollinator garden. It's located behind the office building, and then of course there's also the prairie is a good spot to look for those. One of the things that we'll be doing is adding some additional pollinator gardens along the main entry road, probably next year. And one of the things, we have William Starling Sullivan buried in the cemetery. One of the plants that he first described was Sullivan's milkweed. And that's a very appropriate central Ohio prairie species. So one of the things we're looking at is getting more Sullivan's milkweed, and we're looking at finding some place where we can plant some vertical things like Virgin's Bower and things. And some of those things, the trumpet creeper, some of those things, of course, would be good for hummingbirds too. So right now, you have to kind of look for the butterfly garden, or you have to stand out, walk along the edge of the prairie and see what you can find. But I am hoping in the future that we'll have maybe an actual viewing station specifically to look for hummingbirds.
Elaine's wondering if you have a calendar of the first Saturday topics available?
There is one available on our webpage. I do not have that with me today, but if you look at the Greenlawn Cemetery webpage, or if I'll give you my email address, which is RANDEL_ROGERS@hotmail.com, and I'll have our volunteer coordinator send you one. Email me, and I'll have her email you one back.
And I just put his email address there in the chat box if anybody didn't catch that. And you can always email me also. You'll get an email response from this webinar, so you can reply to that, and I'll get any of those responses. So, and I can also share a link to the calendar in that email response too, so that people can get a link to that as well.
I'm trying to remember this month or if it's next month. I know one of the current topics, our volunteer coordinator is Tracy Blind, who's also the curator at Cedar Bog. So one of the topics, either this month or coming up next month, was one on Cedar Bog. And we also, this year, we had Dave Dyer come out from the Ohio History Connection. I'm working really hard to get a reenactor out for Black History Month this coming month, and actually come out and reenact Benjamin Grierson.
Wow.
And there's a guy here in town that does Civil War period, and I'm thinking the uniform is similar enough he might be able to do that. So we're trying to line up something pretty cool for February, but there's a lot of neat topics on that.
Go ahead and get in any last questions you might have here for Randy as we're wrapping up. But I want to again point out our webinar next month will be on keeping cats indoors. And that will be a special presenter coming from the American Bird Conservancy, and he's the director of their Cats Indoors program for the entire country, so we're very honored to have him. And again, if any of you aren't signed up to receive our email updates, I would encourage you to do that so you don't miss out on any of our upcoming topics. So I'm just putting our website here in the chat box, so that everyone will be able to see that. So go ahead and visit that link for a list of upcoming webinars. But thank you so much, Randy. I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm sure all of our attendees did as well. And thank you, everyone, for joining us, and I hope to see you on an upcoming Lunch with the Birds presentation.